Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, it's been a little bit of a gap now. Fortunately, it's not been that much a gap, about a week and a half, so we do have a little bit of ground to cover, both figuratively and literally, in the case of covering some of the news out of Ukraine. But of course, we have news out of Europe, the Middle East, etc. So it looks like we've got a full show for you. You can strap in for the next couple hours or so, and we'll try to go over as much as we can. We'll have some updates on the news about Iran, what we know about Raisi's helicopter crash, and the new administration there. So, like I said, we'll get to all that in the near future here. But without further ado, I believe you took some inspiration from the French presidency that we have some Macron maps for us. We're
That's right.
renaming Minutia Minute to Macron maps. You
Macron
see,
maps.
that double M, it still works. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Uh,
Wow. So okay. So why don't we start with Harkov? And these maps basically represent, because to be honest, for the last 8, 9, 10 days, this front has gone static. The Ukrainians have been able to inch back a certain amount of territory. The Russians are not committing more troops, so and I think even Western publications understand the Russians are not going to storm and surround Kharkov. If they were going to do that, they would literally need another army, and it could not be the Ukrainian estimate of somewhere between 35 to 45,000 men. Another estimate I saw was that they have 48. Weeb Union reason that it like only about 14,000 are actually at the front in these pockets. The rest are behind. So the Russians are outnumbered in this area, but they have significant more firepower. And the difference is, like, especially if you compare this to the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye, Kherson area, there's no sea behind them. Logistics, supplies, all that kind of thing is much harder to fight in the south than it is in the north because basically this front, everything north of it is just Russia, and there's logistic hubs and whatnot that can move freely. They've been established there for decades, if not centuries. So it's a different kind of strategy. They don't need to have as many men, and they're creating essentially pockets. One area where there's a bit of a pocket going on. So we could go to slide number 2 to get a look at an area that the Ukrainians managed to take back in the last 48 hours. This is on the edges of Lipsy. If you take Lipsy, if the Russians could take Lipsy, then they would have a view of Kharkov, the city, in the distance. Like they would be able to see the high rises and so on. I don't know how well they can see here, but that would be the view that they would have. Now, the other patch of territory, of course, is where there's been a much more intense battle going on for Vovchansk. And so in Vovchansk, which is the third frame, mappers early on last week thought that the Russians controlled the entirety of Volchansk northern half. Okay. As it turns out, there's that pocket in the northern half that they don't. Now, the north and the southern parts of Volchansk are divided by a river. And the Ukrainians, let me get this right, the Ukrainians destroyed the river where it winds on the west side, on the left side, where you see that protrusion by the Russians going down. There are 2 bridges there, and they were taken out, obviously to prevent the Russians from spreading. Then the Russians, to the east of that, to the right, where you can see it's much less dense, following the river, also blew out some bridges around there. What was left were 2 bridges that connect north and south Volchansk, right under the pocket that the Ukrainians control. And this is what I mean about pockets. In this area, which has all kinds of high rises, residential buildings, maybe some civic governmental buildings of one kind or another, maybe a small factory or warehouse. The Russians are letting the Ukrainians go in here, and then they're fab bombing them essentially, right? And this has been, of course, an acute problem. So we'll ignore the next slide. Okay, so let's move down to the Donetsk front.
You're robbing the
This will
people
give
of
you,
quality content, but I digress.
if you want, we can. It was just a joke. We can we can post it. I can you can say that this
You
was.
know, we got to put it at the end of the show after we bring everyone
Okay,
down.
okay, okay. Yeah,
After we talk about all the heavy stuff, then we end on the joke. That's what we got to
you're
do.
right. That's a great idea. Okay, so this next slide is the Donetsk front. You can see that the gains around Ochertine of Avdiivka have been small. Now the Russians did capture the village of Umansk since our last show. Natalyove is another town that they captured as well in the Donetsk front. So they're steadily gaining about 100 yards a day, essentially. So next slide. So this is around Pervomaiske. You can see that the red area where they've captured that, and just north of that, of course, are outlined in white. That is Netalyove. Netalyove is the area that the Russians took since our last show. You can go to the next one for like increased resolution, but it doesn't really matter. Um, the next slide, a big overview is the Chasiv Yar Bakhmut front. And you can see that there have been several new gains that the Russians have made since our last show, particularly in the south, because the Russians have recaptured Klishevka. They've recaptured the heights north of Klishevka, both heights. Now, they control, to be fair, the Russians controlled the eastern heights for months, I would say since the end of 2023. But now they control both. The next slide, if we zoom in, um, will give us a slightly, better resolution. The fighting in this area is incredibly tense. There is a very stiff Ukrainian resistance here. It understands that Chasiv Yar is very, very pivotal, and that they also understand what the Russians are doing by opening up fronts in the north in Harkov. The Ukrainians are forced to defend these areas. They don't want to lose any more territory. And so they know that the Ukrainians are short of men and they will have to rush them, which means they will have to rush them from other areas. That has happened, including from Krinky. So the Ukrainians have completely left Krinky now. In the way of deploy, the Russians do not advance too quickly in Donetsk. Okay. But it was never, they were never going to do anything in Krinky. Like, I don't know if people understand that. Like, it's not a game where, like, well, I'm still in Krinky, therefore I control Krinky. Like, I mean, if you didn't lose lives so much, like, yeah, okay, yeah. So let's go to, yeah, I see yeah, so you can see the Chasiv Yar, which is the last one that says 7:10 p.m. The little area around the micro district. The Russians have also expanded their control past Bogdanovka, and they're now in Kalinovka, on the outskirts of Kalinovka. This is just northeast of Chasiv Yar. They were pushed out of the micro district of Chasiv Yar, but they are back in. Now we go to the next slide. This is let's say you could call this the Kupiansk Svatove Kremenaya front. You can see that the Russians have made some gains here. They've reactivated this area, an area that's been kind of has not been successful, particularly around Kupiansk for the Russians, after having quite a bit of success last year in August 2023. Um, so if you look at the next slide, which is a bit of a close-up, you can see that the Russians are inching towards. Eventually, they're going to go to. They want the so-called river. This is on the border between Harkov and Lugansk. This is, I believe, around the town of Berestove. Um, so let's ignore the next two slides and go to the third slide. And this will explain better what the Russians are up to. So the gains that the Russians have made here are kind of significant because they inch closer towards Petropavlovka and Kupiansk. They've captured a town called, I believe, Ivanovka, which is next to Stepova Novoselka. It's north of Klishevka. This is a town that the Russians captured, I think, since our last show. That's the white outline at the top. And the red outline is Ivanovka, which is the area that the Russians captured. A few days earlier, the Russians captured the town of Berestova. So obviously, what they want to do is go further west to the Oskal River that they lost, and eventually they want to go as far south as to Liman. And then they lost it in the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The last slide that I've sent you, but not the last slide that we're going to see at the bottom, is again in the Kremenaya area. The Russians have made more gains around the forest that they call Sherwood Forest of all things. So you can see that everywhere the Russians are making gains. I'm not going to show you pictures of Robotina because the Russians have recaptured the entirety of Robotina, and it no longer looks like a deep pot or something, or upside down, or a funnel. It's just like a small depression now. But there is a place not far, which is also on the southern front, on the border of Zaporozhye and southwestern Donetsk, and that is Staromayorska and Urozhanye. This is the third picture from the top. Sorry, the third one from the bottom. I'm sorry.
I know what you meant.
Yeah. So the fences here are collapsing. The Ukrainians basically control the last 10% on the outskirts. It depends who you're looking at. If it's deep state, the Russians control 70 to 80%. If it's I don't know, we Union, then it's like 80 or 90 for the Russians, or Syriac maps is, basically close to 100%, 90 plus percent. So you can see Staromayorska, the Russians have taken it. To the right, southeasterly direction is Urozhanye. The Russians are now retaking Urozhanye as well. I don't have a picture of the advance that they did there, except for the last show that we did. And maybe the slide right beneath this one. Yes, the slide right beneath the one that we're currently talking about. Put that up. Yes, this is the one that I was talking about, Berestove and Ivanovka in the Kupiansk area, right? So just follow the highway where the gains have been going on. There is a highway that goes on an angle towards Petropavlovsk and Kupiansk. That's the urban center that the Russians basically want. That's a key center. And the Ukrainians have been very successful in defending this area, partly because they control just the southern tip of the forest to the north of it. So you can see that There is regular fighting. It's heavy. It's active in just about every area. You see more turtle tanks used by the Russians. You see the Ukrainians doing countermeasures, but there are telltale signs that maybe things aren't going that well, and even headlines that seem to reflect some of the things that have happened on the battlefield. For instance, I spoke to you in the south, what's going on in the southern Donetsk, Zaporozhye area in Staromayorska, right? So when the Russians moved in with at least two columns of heavy artillery, sorry, armored vehicles, there was at least two turtle tanks, but there was no resistance. A similar event happened in Krasnogorovka, which is in the Donbass, not far from Novomihailovka. And the Russians moved in with an armored column, again, led by one or two turtle tanks, armored personnel vehicles, regular tanks with, basic cope cages. Also, that area, they have not collapsed. And now you're seeing like absolutely crazy headlines coming up. Headlines that are, let me see if it's a headline that was altered, okay? Because, okay, so the Telegraph had a headline that said Ukraine knows it is finished. Then it got changed to Ukraine now knows that it has just months left to survive. And then it changes again to without Western armaments, Ukraine may only have months left.
Is that not just the flow of the narrative compressed
Yeah.
into a small bite-sized chunk? That's what this war has been from the beginning. It's Ukraine is doomed to lose unless you dump another 30 billion on it. Then it
Yeah.
can continue. Then that's what's always been. It's always been they start out, they create that sense of doom and gloom. Then that tips over to urgency, in which case the only way Ukraine can survive is just with a little more Western support. The only way that Ukraine can retake Crimea is if you just pass another aid package. If the Republicans would stop hamstringing aid, then Ukraine would
Yes.
survive. We would be having our summer beach party in Crimea. That was the narrative for a number of months.
Oh, yes.
And we saw how that turned out. And look, I will say outright, the aid does bolster Ukraine. The aid does, of course, buy Ukraine time.
Yep.
But barring outright intervention, and I'm not even saying that has to be direct American intervention, but just with some of the rumblings we've heard out of places like Poland in particular, as well as other European states, the Ukrainian war effort is bound for defeat. There's just no other way to put it in terms of manpower, in terms of resources. You can pour all the money on the world that you want into this, and like I said, especially in terms of keeping the Ukrainian state functional, it's going to do that. It's going to keep the civil servants paid. It's going to keep the army especially paid, the military especially paid, which is probably the most vital thing with that. But
not pay too much.
of course not. Yeah, just enough to stave off a coup. Just enough to stave off a coup.
Yep.
But you can dump all the money in the world on Ukraine, but if there simply are not enough armaments for them to buy, there's simply not enough munitions for them to buy, then in terms of actual material support for the war effort, it makes no difference in that regard.
Right. I mean, the New York Times, for instance, did a small article, which I'll read a short bit out of, about the 5th Assault Brigade fighting in the Chasiv Yar area. Depleted but not defeated, Ukraine's frontline brigade fighting to the east to the last man. That is like literally part of the title. The men of the 5th Separate Assault Brigade, under the command of Major Ruslan Habinet, are determined to defend the key strategic town of Chasiv Yar from Russian invaders. The sacrifice needed to do so cannot be comprehended by those at home reading the news, he says. Quote, to the last Ukrainian, end quote. The New York Times, well, that's somebody editorializing. The New York Times UK says the quiet part out loud in their own headline, which I just read. The Ukrainian Armed Forces Brigade, the unit was devastated by losses, illness, and desertion. That's interesting that they mentioned desertion. The newspaper writes, Now the brigade consists of 90% mobilized citizens of Ukraine. Ukrainian officers are quickly promoted, which indicates huge losses of the Ukrainian armed forces. The brigade suffers losses due to a lack of ammunition. Now, what's interesting, and um, I decided to like see, you find a story, and you want to know like what does this chat think of it, think of this story. So basically, Weeb Union had a video that he published a few days ago. May even have been Friday or Saturday, I don't know. And for those who are catching the show, we're recording Wednesday night. So uh, he said, and this was written up in a newspaper as well, but Weeb Union's sources in the Ukrainian and Russian military echo what these um, newspaper articles are saying. And that is that what the Ukrainians are doing right now, which we've outlined on this show months ago, is that they're getting recruits and they're pushing those recruits to the front. Whereas we used to think, and they probably did at one point, get like a month to a month and a half's training. They're now getting 3 to 4 days training. They are literally just learning the absolute basics of how an assault gun or a machine gun works.
And mind you, these
Maybe
are
the
also the men who are anywhere from, I think the average age is 30, no, 43 to
45.
43 to 45 years old is what the average age
Yeah,
on the Ukrainian front line is now.
yeah,
And while you might think that, of course, that is because a large casualty of young people, you actually look at the conscription laws, it's not quite the case, where you still do have a lot of young men untouched by conscription because of Ukraine's demographics. They don't want to throw that in the meat grinder yet because they know it would just be the demographic death knell of their already dwindling nation. And you look at the emigration rates from Ukraine, you look at the birth rates. It's not a pretty picture. It's probably one of the most egregious of even the
it's
former
horrible.
of the former communist bloc countries. And like we're comparing that with like places like Bulgaria and Moldova too, which are also very blighted by those issues, and they're not even in a state of war. But we're talking middle-aged men, men who are well past their prime, especially compared to the crop of men the Russians have, considering the fact that the Russians also have several times more men for troop rotation as well, so keeping them fresh, getting their men experienced. A proper war effort. Just, I mean, look, there's criticism you can levy, but a proper war effort nonetheless, as opposed to Ukrainian, where you have these men who are well past their prime with minimal training being put into. I know the word's been used a million times over, but there's no word better for it. Meat grinder.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so it's beautifully put, by the way. Now, I put this in, maybe I shouldn't mention the chat, right? Because it could reflect on the owner of the chat, but it doesn't, because, these chats have hundreds and thousands of members, and they can't control everything,
Oh,
honestly.
I love Telegram.
Yeah, Telegram is just insane. So I put it in one chat, and they're going, now, all these chats, I would say, if they're not pro-Russian, they acknowledge that Russia is winning. And efforts to propone a narrative that contradicts that is laughed at. There's no wiggle room in, let's say, the perception of these narratives. The chat won't allow it. And if somebody comes in, and says, "Oh yeah, but the Russians lost that many men in a ATACMS hit," they'll just say it's cope. It doesn't change the overall progress on the front line. Okay, so this particular chat, which is still honestly mostly pro-Russian, thought that like this was just trash talk. Someone said, I don't know, kind of surprised me. I sent it to I love Z the Right People and Missiles and Nukes. The guys are actually, everybody in those chats are crazy. I love them, and especially Missiles and Nukes, because the owner of the chat likes to keep this guy Johnny. They purport he's Albanian, but nobody really knows. And in a way, it could even be an admin that's allowed to trash talk, just so, because he'll say something kind of, I mean, he's definitely NAFO pro Ukraine, but it'll be kind of stupid. So then he'll quote this phrase by Johnny, and then people just laugh at it because it is kind of funny and stupid. So, anyways, I put it there, and Z the right people. I have to say, like, yeah, it's slightly, it's a shit post account, it's a troll account, but you will learn stuff there. You will learn about like over the horizon radar and how it works. You will learn what are the areas where the Russian military is still suffering and hasn't improved. Like you will learn all of that stuff if you check on it daily. You will. So I put this same thing that Weeb Union said, and totally different response. Yeah, this is believable. Yeah, I mean, have were there not other people who said this, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of funny how how people. I mean, there's just no accounting for it. I don't know. All these accounts to varying degrees are pro-Russian, so I thought that was kind of funny.
Well,
But
I know you'd mentioned the whole shit posting aspect, and I think I just have to say that if you actually want quality coverage of this war, you have to find somebody who is willing to do that, and that's not a self promotion here because I know that we're one in a sea, and we have very loyal fans, which I certainly do appreciate. But you go to some of the best people in this. I would say aside from like the hypermap autists, think somebody like Dima or Weeb Union, um, like I said, hypermap autists in their own right.
mm,
Most of the best coverage you get from this war is people who are willing to address it with a bit of levity. And I think with
yeah,
such a serious topic, like, of course, if you go too far, you're not going to get anything done. It is just going to become a giant meme, and you're going to fall into stupid argumentation. But if you don't approach it with a degree of levity, you're gonna get lost in the weeds. And I like I said, so just to bolster your point there.
yeah, yeah. So, and I did mention over the horizon radar, and we've been tracking on this show the amount of times that the Ukrainians have launched strikes against Crimea, against the Black Sea Fleet, the Kerch Bridge, uh, dozens of oil fields, and so on. Not that they're still not trying to do that; they are, and they've, of course, also hit Belgorod, Lugansk, Gorlovka, and killed civilians. But and to be fair, the Russians made an attack on Kharkov. Initially, 5 dead. That's gone up to a dozen civilians. Apparently, the Ukrainians are holding some of their munitions and military vehicles in a mall. So, uh, but the thing that the Ukrainians have been doing, okay, and this is south of Rostov on Don, near Krasnodar, but like north of Suchi, okay, Anapa, that area of the eastern side of the Black Sea. The Russians have what they call over the horizon radar. This is to detect nuclear missiles. The other place that was hit, there was another attack, for instance, in a similar installation in Voronezh, but there was definitely a hit on the one in southern Russia. There was another hit in like central western Russia, well east of Kazan, which is already east of Moscow. Okay. And the thing about these radar systems is that because they're over the horizon radar used to detect the launch of nuclear missiles, they therefore cannot really detect anything close by. And I think this story is going to dovetail very nicely with, the Macron maps and just a lot of the smack that's being spoken by the West at the moment. So why are they attacking these facilities? Because these facilities are used for um, nuclear launches against Russia. They're not used to detect missiles that have been, I don't know, launched from Odessa or let's say um, Chernigov or Venetia or any of these places, right? No, they have to be. It won't even see that, right? This particular type of radar system. But what shocked me was learning today that these radar systems actually show They are there to see what is being launched at on Iran.
Very interesting.
Right. Like, I thought it was pretty interesting before I found out that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, before you found out that,
But now
I
it's
would,
at a whole other level.
yes, and I would say this is the first time I'm actually hearing about that was for the Iranians, that it was to detect launches towards Iran. But when you first hear this, when you first hit it, I hear that they're trying to hit these warning systems. You think it's probably the gravest of consequences when it comes to the exchanges between the Ukraine, Russia, and that spilling over into the West. And I don't want to downplay what's going on now, but in a way, it's. I don't want to say it's less severe, but it does completely change the perspective on why they're doing this. It shows that they're not brazen enough. The idea that they're planning some sort of all-out attack on Russia, but it does show that Iran very well be within their scope. And this is, of course, is after the Raizi helicopter crash. And I will say, given everything I've seen of it just in the past couple weeks since it happened, I still don't see any indication that it was a deliberate assassination. I still am pretty sold on it being an accident. Once again, they do themselves no favors when they do these sort of things in almost the immediate wake of Raizi's death, and just their conduct in general towards the Iranians. Uh, like I said, I'm pretty sold on the idea that yeah, it probably was an accident, older equipment, bad weather conditions, etc. But like I said, there's a reason it raises eyebrows. There's a reason why so many people are reasonably convinced that this was some sort of preemptive strike, that this was some sort of targeting of the Iranian state. Now, it seems like business has gone on as usual in Iran after the period of funeral, that they've appointed a new president. His name escapes me at the moment. I'll like I said, I'll consult my notes. We'll get to that when we get to the Middle East. But like I said, that it creates a whole new world of implications, and especially in light of Israel, because
You're right.
at this point, where we are right now in end of May, beginning of June 2024, about a month before the Democratic National Convention, really getting into election season proper in the United States, which has been a pretty subdued election season in the U.S. And I think that a large part of that is simply because it is a Trump-Biden repeat, that a lot of people aren't as heavily invested, except the people who are very partisan on both sides. That I know they have the whole Trump trial nonsense going on. But if there's going to be any further strikes in Iran, they're going to come from Israel, because the U.S. can not afford to take that drastic of military action in an election year, especially after the humiliation of Operation Prosperity Guardian, or whatever joke
Right.
they put on the Red Sea last year.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. You know, the Houthis released video footage of the latest Reaper. This is the fifth or sixth Reaper of the U.S. that they've downed. These are $30 million plus uh, aeronautic vehicles. Another four or five have been downed, belonging to other countries like the UK. Um, but as I was saying, you know, Putin, said, we're talking about Macron and the Europeans basically saying, we're going to give them permission. We're going to give them, which is insane because, I mean, they've already done it. Like, permission to increase, you're making it look like they never did before. And this is partly because, they want to, like, if Ukraine doesn't do well, someone has to get blamed, and it'll have to be those countries that actually didn't care what Ukraine did, but we're going to pretend that they didn't give them permission. Anyhow, so this is what Putin said not long ago. Entirely, the attacks on Russia proper, that these attacks on Russia from some systems used by NATO were entirely operated from start to finish by U.S. military directly, and were done from space and near orbit. Right, that's his assertion. Now, as I said earlier, we know that they've already launched various attacks on Belgorod, and I'm not talking about RDK guys and freedom of Belarus and freedom of Russia platoon, battalions going over the border and killing um, pensioners. I'm talking about
Yeah, the retard
the
regiments.
yeah. So. I mean, whatever. Like, I would say it's worth paying attention to. And the reason is because the rhetoric is so consistent now. What they're basically like, you can look at it as a bluff that remember Lavrov on the 18th of May said they've already decided to attack. It's already decided upon. What we're seeing is public consensus building, right? So, but what will they do? How bad will it be? What kind of provocation are they looking for? What kind of retaliation are they looking for enough of a um, uh, an offense to the West that then the West says we're intervening? Or is it a bluff? Or is it this? Or um, are they trying to create a scenario where they can negotiate with the Russians to at least freeze the conflict temporarily in order for the American elections to go fairly smoothly?
Well, that actually reminds me of a couple pieces of news I had just to bring up, and I do think this dovetails nicely into that. That they've already been gaslighting, saying, "Oh, Putin's ready for negotiations for the 17th time this war, and that he's ready for a ceasefire, and et cetera, et cetera." You all know the story here. But also, there is coming out of the rumor mill uh, the the renewed idea of a NATO deployment to Ukraine. In which case, a ceasefire would be the perfect cover for that. You bring in these troops in the middle of a ceasefire, you get the U.S. elections over with, all that's taken care of, and then all of a sudden you have this frozen war in Ukraine because at a certain point, the Russians, at least by the
Mm-hmm.
West calculus, isn't going to push further past a certain point in Ukraine if you have Western troops there, if you have NATO troops there, at risk of crossing a tripwire and creating a massive escalation. And just some of the figures that have been floated around. This is from a Telegram channel, Eurasia and Multipolarity. So their bias is just outright in the front. But they do pretty good coverage, in my opinion. Not the greatest you'll see on Telegram by any means or anywhere else, but uh, credit where credit is due. I'll just put it that way. I like much of their work. So it's speculated that the U.S. is going to put around 35,000, Poland 15,000, Romania 12,000, France 8,000, UK 8,000, the Baltic states combined total of 5,000, the Czechs 5,000, Germany and Italy 3,000 each, and 6,000 others from other NATO countries. And that is going to be the first of three contingents, and then once the three proposed contingents are put together, that would be about 300,000 NATO troops in Ukraine, which I think even by a speculation is an ambitious project. It does seem like if they are going to do this, it's probably going to be a fraction of what this is, and they're testing the waters. It's something that they're going to see what they can get away with, and also it waives a lot of the criticism from the more hawkish elements both in Ukraine and abroad that the West isn't doing enough when they quite literally have boots on the ground. And it, in a way, given the multinational nature of this coalition, removes some blame for the U.S. If things go wrong. It does push the burden onto the Europeans. It does push the responsibility onto the Europeans. Of course, the U.S. has a large contingency there, but when you put it all together, they're not a majority. They're the plurality, but not the majority. And it does put pressure on the European states to do more, which is what the U.S. has wanted since the beginning of this war. They've wanted Europe to bear the brunt of this war, and in many ways it has, but they want even more from it, of course. But it,
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
they're not. I mean, for instance, the U.S. this June will not be going to Switzerland. The biggest donor by far. I mean, America donates more than the next five, six donors combined, and I'm being very conservative. It's even worse than that. But they're not going to this so-called peace summit in I don't know if it's in Bern, but it is in Switzerland. I mean, the whole thing's a sham, anyways. In
It's a
any
Zelensky
case,
fundraiser. He goes there,
it
shakes
is,
hands, and begs money.
exactly, exactly. But I do think for them it's important for the Ukrainians. Biden not going there or not even having Blinken there is a slight. It- you know, um, Tell me how you love Israel more than you love Ukraine without
I'm
telling
here
me.
first as a Jew, Anthony Blinken. His words, not mine. I would never make any anti-Semitic comments, but those are the words of our Secretary of State, who just so happens to be Jewish. Um, but just as a small aside, I know I not to derail you too much. Just a funny piece of data I saw that I wanted to bring up is that according to the Kiev School of Economics, more than half of foreign businesses in Russia have remained there since the beginning of the war, despite sanctions. So
Mm,
that's fun. That's I think pretty funny because you have a lot of them that just outright remain. Some of them curtailed operations, and then a minority actually exited. In which case, with the way those businesses were set up, they were franchises, so the Russians were able to assume the supply lines and just create knockoff products. I mean, we've all seen the knockoff McDonald's. We've all seen
yeah.
every Western brand has a knockoff of the same quality, except just now owned by the Russians. But that's aside the point. But I mean, getting back to the troop deployments, getting back to Zelensky and the so-called peace conference in Switzerland, one of the many peace conferences they try to do. At least the U.S. would show up to the Gulf state ones, but like I said, these things are basically fundraisers for Zelensky, so he can go there, grease palms, demand more money for the war effort, etc., etc. Russia never participates. In fact, there's a lot of cases where Russia isn't even invited to these.
Yeah, they're not even in this one. So,
No. I know the Saudis at least had the common courtesy to send them an invite, but of course that wasn't reciprocated because they just why would Putin or Lavrov waste their time with this nonsense for what is, like I said, to repeat, a Zelensky fundraiser? But it, I mean, there is every desire to escalate this war, especially from certain parties. And with all those numbers I just listed, I want you to bear in mind that, according to opinion polls, still across European countries, it's rare to see more than 10% of the population support any sort of direct military confrontation with Russia, despite everything, despite all the propaganda that's pushed, just constantly, even before the beginning of this war, and that even support for Ukraine in general is wavering. That people just don't see it as a worthwhile cause anymore, especially in the face of other very real political issues. And then you have people on the complete other side of the issue, like in a lot of the Hungarians, particularly Orban and Peter Zjarto, if you want to talk about it just on a governmental level. Of course, Fico in Slovakia, who is still recovering from his assassination attempt, who just want to cut the Ukraine project entirely, cut their losses, and begin détente and normalization of relations with Russia. So, in terms of outright hawkishness towards Russia, it's the opinion is an absolute minority on the continent, even despite other latent anti-Russian sentiments. It's so
mhm,
the
mhm.
idea of selling a nation on this is ridiculous. Selling European nations on this is ridiculous. And you might not think some of these numbers are that high, but you do have to recall that, once again, when we're talking about European nations, some of these countries barely crack 10 millions in terms of population. I mean, think about what's the Baltic states' combined population? What, 5 million? Somewhere around there. And they're talking about sending 5,000 soldiers. And same with the Czech Republic. I know the Czech Republic is also around, like, I don't know, it's like 10, 15 million. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there. And like I said, that's still like 5,000 soldiers from them. Germany and Italy, given their populations, I know there's some of the larger countries in Europe. 3,000 isn't that much, but it also does it does create a little bit of distance, despite the fact that both Germany and Italy did express a tepid support for Hungary's opposition to the proposed energy sanctions that are supposed to be coming up for a vote in the European Union soon. So there is, despite rhetoric, a wavering of support for the war effort on a governmental level in several European countries.
Yeah, you see this kind of talk, especially from countries like Estonia and Lithuania, you know. But Poland as well, of course. Poland publicly announced today that Ukraine can fire using its weapons against Russia. pre SMO Russia. So curiously, the country that has helped Ukraine launch the most amount of munitions supplied by the West and themselves into Russia, America, has not allowed them. But because they already allowed them. I just think the whole thing is so absurd. The next thing I guess we're waiting for is, are they going to now? There have been stories that in Yaroviv, just 30 kilometers outside of Lvov, there were more mercenaries that met there recently. And again, it was another Kinshasa strike. Now, this is Dima from Military Summary Channel. I'm not suggesting anything for or against. I sub to him. Generally, he's quite good. Uh, he is such a stickler for, like, this territory that either side has claimed that they conquered 3 months ago, but because there's no video footage, he goes, but to this day we've still not received any video. I just love the way every program, this channel condemns violence of any kind anywhere in the world. It's pretty fun. I love how he covers all the bases. Anyhow, so he says that there was a Kinshasa strike, and it could have been mercenaries. Now, what I can say is in the Chasiv Yar area, the Russians did kill a French mercenary with French flags, so he could have been one of the legionnaires that have been there. I don't know. Um, Now the forces, but it's a gradual thing, right? They're going to send in 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 5,000, and then those numbers will increase because they want this, because the West is buying time, right? To some degree. But at the same time, even though the Russians do not have a force of 500,000 on the north of Ukraine, that force is probably no more than 100 to 150,000. That still allows them to have a concentration of men, probably in two or three areas, but definitely two, that they can open up these fronts, anywhere from Chernigov, Sumy, to somewhere between Sumy and Harkov. And, that would distract the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are waiting for the F-16s. I am certain that the Europeans and the Americans are now thinking, like, once, because Denmark, I think, donated something like 30 F-16s.
Which was their entire fleet.
Yes, they donated their entire fleet. And this is what I mean. Like, last year, that was unthinkable. Now they know they could lose, and they are throwing good money after bad. They are determined not to lose this, and in many ways, their actions are basically forcing them to eventually enter the war. And maybe the craziest thing that's happened in Britain in the last week or so, since Rishi Sunak announced an election on July the 4th, like, tell me,
Completely colonized.
yeah, tell me how you're a simp without telling me it's so lame. But that in itself, that messaging, right? That, like, we are the greatest allies, of course, after, the Jews in Israel, um, et
What do you
cetera, et
mean
cetera.
Ukraine is the second Israel?
Yes, yeah. I mean, like, Britain is like two or three for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyhow,
that sounds about right.
yeah. So, um, he took like a day off, Sunak, after he announced the election, after he gave this horrible lie in the rain that the British economy is outperforming both the German, French, and the American economy. It is a world of absurdities, right? So he then came back after a day's hiatus to recoup, I suppose, and said that he is, you know, um, going to, if they're elected, they're going to reintroduce conscription. This caused a kerfuffle that forced him to create his own TikTok account. I kid you not. And his first video is like, "Hey, just going to interrupt your non-political viewing today." Like, it's it's that guy, high fellow students or fellow young people,
He's every
Buscemi.
Indian you've ever worked with in a corporate setting.
Yeah, literally, right? And I mean, it's pathetic, right? And he says, "No, I'm not sending you to the army." And there's a graphic of a tank that has been xed out. So, um,
And of course, they have some
I guess what I'm
throwaway
saying is,
civil
is it's
service
it's kind of
program.
serious, right? They're
Yeah.
they're they're kind of thinking like, yeah, we're probably going to have to do some kind of a draft or change like European society dramatically because like I think what they're realizing is we're going to lose this war.
What I do think is
And we were
interesting.
supposed to win this war in the first year. Like in 2022, we were supposed to win this war.
What
And
it
2023, it was just, delayed by 6 to 8 months, but we're going to win it. And now it's obvious to them that they have to go in. They have to go in.
Yes,
Um,
after the Ukrainians pissed away the 2023 counteroffensive, it became an unsalvageable situation by the Ukrainians themselves to the point where outside intervention would be required in order to continue to prosecute this war. And I do think it's interesting that you bring up the UK conscription law because some of this is old news, some of this is more recent news. I'll start with more recent. Is that the U.S. is closing its gaps within its conscription system with the selective service system, where traditionally what it was is young men 18 to 26 had to register for it under threat of legal penalty. But now they've just done away with that, and they've just done automatic registration for that, and it closes the gap. So pretty much any man between 18 and 26 in the United States is now going to be automatically registered if this law goes through. Older one, this was around the time of uh, Western Easter, so that would have been like late March, early April. I think it was like the weekend before. Out of Poland, they had an expansion of their conscription laws that expanded all the circumstances in which they could continue conscription. And I had the document for the longest time. I was going to read on the show. It was just one of those things that slipped my mind. Translated from the original Polish, of course, but it was just a vast expansion of conscription laws under which the circumstances which the Polish government could implement a military mobilization. So, and I think Poland is it's probably the most pivotal country for that. Um, and to a lesser degree, say somewhere like Romania, the Baltic states, etc. These countries that are going to be that first line that go into there. But Poland in particular was concerning. And then the UK, which is probably the most significant American vassal within Europe at this point. Them doing that, it is foreboding. I don't know any other words for it.
yeah. So, we're back to that idea that if it's, how long have we been saying, and I've been saying on this show, like, this is a pretty big deal, even if the Ukraine war is wrapped up, right? Like, America will not stop trying to defeat Russia, like, forever. Like, America wants for Russia what it's done to Germany and Britain and France.
But even
Probably
I'd say even more severe.
worse. Yeah, more severe than what it's done to Serbia, right? Like, essentially, that's what it wants, right? And it won't stop. Like, either America dies or Russia dies. That's it. Right. Um, so that's why we've always said in this show that even if Ukraine stops, don't be surprised if there isn't something that happens in the Baltic Sea or in Kaliningrad or something in, I don't know, Syria or Dagestan, like
I mean, look at the
something.
Caucasus. We'll get into the Georgia law and
Yes.
how that actually did go through. But as part of their efforts in Georgia, they were trying to push yet another Maidan on top of the color revolution Georgia had in '08 that started the war in the process of current Russian-Georgian relations in the first place.
Hmm.
They've been trying desperately to find some other avenue of this, and like I said, like you had said, they had created an existential war for themselves. You can go back, you can believe Putin, you can disbelieve Putin, whatever, but I think it is pretty undeniable that there was a 2 decade effort on part of the Russians up until I would say the actual beginning of this war with proper Russian intervention. So we're talking February 24th, 2022, for some sort of reconciliation between the Russian and the West on the Russian side, and that was pissed away at every opportunity, and the Americans have created for themselves what is an existential war, and this is it's they've checkmated themselves. I don't know any other way to put this. And I don't think this is a particularly Biden problem, even though I think he exacerbates it severely, even more than, say, Trump would, of
Hmm.
just the complete loss of credibility of America on the global stage. I mean, you have the NATO countries, you have Europe, who are going to kiss the American ring simply because they are vassals of America. But even Turkey, once again a NATO country, when Blinken showed up, it was a pitiful welcome. And then his welcome in China was even more pathetic. Uh, hasn't even touched several parts of the world. Any sort of goodwill and good relations with the Gulf states have completely fallen through. Russia's completely assumed that gap. China's completely become the economic engine of the Middle East when it comes to investment and infrastructure project. They've overtaken that.
Yeah.
Uh, Gulf state banking is seeing a new renaissance. Even the Russians are actually evading sanctions through Gulf state banks. So even a country like Egypt, also in the Middle East, has become a very profitable middleman. India has benefited from a meteoric rise by being able to play middleman between the West and Russia in terms of trade, and even these smaller nations like I know Kyrgyzstan was one of the ones that would be used for sanctions evasion. But point being is, within a matter of now, look, I know there was decline beforehand, but within a matter of just 2 years, the amount of influence and prestige America has lost has been,
Yeah.
I would say, unprecedented for just about any empire.
Yeah, and in a way, they've accelerated the thing that they've hated the most. But as I've always said, you never know. Like, there's a very good chance they will not act rationally, right? There are a lot of people who, like, in many ways, they're just like, the dogs that eat the crumbs from the table, but are nonetheless very proud to be, associated with America, or are patriotic about America. This does not mean necessarily people in our sphere. I'm not even necessarily talking about the dissident right. I mean, anyone from, like, Graham Lindsay to, like, I don't know, some two-bit, like, prime minister in the Baltic countries, or your German boomer who's worried about racism and the AFD. I'm talking about these people who,
Or even like on the quote unquote right wing side of the coin, a lot of these, like I said, boomer Eastern Europeans who really did, as we discussed last episode, who bought into the American mythology of the blue
yeah.
jeans, freedom, and rock and roll, and still are still infatuated, still
Like
infatuated
Blinken.
with the Ronald Reagan America, so to speak.
Right, right. And so, like, I worry about, like, what America will do in order to stop this, right? I mean, in a way that I've always said that if they go in, it has to be something so lightning fast, so devastating, the Russians won't even think about continuing the war. It really has to be like that. They can't be, and that's where you worry about, tactical nukes and all that kind of stuff.
Well, the question is, what can they do that doesn't lead to outright escalation? Like, what is that middle point where it's going to deter the Russians, but also not lead to a larger response? Because they could do a one-off thing, something that's relatively weak. The Russians shrug it off. There's been several of
Mm-hmm.
those, and you could
Mm-hmm.
actually consider a lot of what's been going on in the Black Sea. A lot of attacks on the Russian Navy have been more or less British attacks on the Russian Black Sea fleet. I don't think that's
Right.
controversial to say at all. They can shrug those off. They can saber rattle. They can employ rhetoric, but it's not anything they really need a drastic response to. But then on the other hand, if they were to do something uh, that was that swift, that grand of a strike, the Russians are bound to respond. So what's that middle point that deters them from any further action that doesn't provoke an frankly apocalyptic response?
That's a tough one, and we may not know unless we factor in that all of this is really just to keep things looking good till November, right?
Oh,
Even those headlines that say that Ukraine is going to snap within a few months, it's going to be over. Now, there have been generals who have been interviewed for these New York Times stories. New York Times is just one of them, but there's Spiegel, Politico, the whole array of Western press publications, who are saying, it's incredibly dire. We've lost it already. Blah blah blah. That could be because they want to activate that portion of the U.S. That's very, very heavily invested, that now thinks this is existential, and like they simply can't live without being the most powerful country in the world. Like there isn't anything like what. How would life even be worth living if that's not the case, right? Um, so you always have to worry about those people, what they're willing to do. Um, Yeah. So is this just tough talk? Is this, I mean, it's not enough really to save Ukraine. We can say that, right? It's not enough. Even now, according to these same articles, help is not arriving quickly enough. They talk about 60 F-16s, but they don't have 60 pilots for these F-16s. There was an attack in Western Ukraine that took place. The Russia is still doing some of the massive bombing. I did record with Dmitry from World War Now on Saturday, and that very night there was and Sunday, back to back, there were attacks all the way to Western Ukraine, and the Polish and the Americans are flying their jets on the border with Ukraine, right? Like part of that, they're messaging to the Russians. But this comes a few days after there were talks that they think it's perfectly okay for Poland or Lithuania or Romania to shoot down missiles flying somewhere in Ukraine from their own borders. That's next, right? After they say Ukraine can fire at Russia proper, to, well, why can't Romania, fire, can't shoot down missiles that are flying towards this or that city, or Poland, right? Like for now, the war has gone in a certain measured way that's pounding and grinding the Ukrainians. And I don't know if you cut that interview with Eric Prince and Tucker Carlson, but Prince is of the opinion that uh, the Ukrainian death toll is in the hundreds of thousands. And sure enough, there was also an article about, of all things, Burisma now has been implicated um, in providing super cheap burial services that put 7 or 8 other Ukrainian companies out of business. It's just so bleak. But I guess
And
for the Ukrainians, it's worth it.
I mean, on that bleak note, I know there is. I think it's on Twitter. His name is Fennec Radar, something along that. He does
Mm,
pretty interesting coverage, and one of the things that actually drew my attention to him was he does have an ongoing thread of just pictures and photos of Ukrainian cemeteries month after month across the
right,
country,
right.
and it's I've never seen anything like it, frankly.
Hmm.
And we're supposed to believe Zelensky, of course, telling us
31,000.
31,000, as opposed to the Russian 300,000. Comical. It would be comical if frankly wasn't so grim. But
Hmm.
I mean, say what you will about the Ukrainian project. I think I've made my thoughts on the Ukrainian project, Zelensky, all of that very clear. I mean, but we're talking about, and I agree with Eric Prince's assessment that hundreds of thousands of men dead, and for what? What was the what was the ultimate goal for this? What were they ever hoping to accomplish? Now I know that the West, I know that the people who planned this war out from the beginning, from all the way back in 2013, 2014, had no regard for the lives of Ukrainians. Even say the Western Ukrainian nationalists, they're all just the same backwards, evil, degenerate. They probably wouldn't use that word, but the backwards evil, far right people to them. They make no
Yeah.
distinction as far as they're concerned. The only distinction they make is, oh, hey, they're willing to fight on our behalf, so let's make an alliance of convenience. But as far as are concerned, the more of them that drop dead in the war effort, the better on both sides. That's really what the West's position has been. And I mean, there's some deeper things you can get in about that if you want to speculate on certain plans for the future of Ukraine. But like I said, you can go back to George Soros, 1995, I believe it was. He outright said that this is what needed to happen if Russia didn't submit. That we just need to send wave after wave of Eastern Europeans into battle until Russia collapses. And it looks like they're trying to do that now. And
Yeah, absolutely. And think how, I mean, you're right. That it is that template that is the strategy since 93 when it was first published. But remember around 2013, 2014, just as Maidan was getting started, just as Maidan was wrapping up and the war in Donbass was flaring, uh, there was all the, I mean, what did it revolve around, right? Basically, it revolved around making Russian speakers in Ukraine Ukrainian speakers exclusively, and like if they had buttered the Russians, right? If they had played nice with them, right, and cultivated a liberal Russian segment in Ukraine that with a population behind it that would want to integrate with the West. And yes, that would be at the expense of Russia. If they had created this sort of unique Slavic space of Ukrainian and Russian, both of them liberal minded, both of them wanting to integrate with the West, if they had cultivated that, right? Because there, it would have there would have been a better outcome for them, and it would have been a very bad outcome for the Russians. Now, of course, people can criticize me for saying this. There's a lot of ifs, obviously, right? And as you already put it so well, that's not the template that they were going to use. The thing is that the West hates these people so much they would never take that risk of them becoming prosperous and integrated into the West. They would always have to be integrated as lower than everyone else in the West, in Western Europe. And because everyone in Western Europe already understands they're lower than America, right? And I believe it's this single thing that prevented that from happening. So there had to be this kind of tightrope that the Americans who were propagandizing and working with Ukrainian nationalists from World War II through the Gladio days and into the early years and thereafter of the fall of the Soviet Union, that could never happen, right? That's why they pressed so hard on this hate for Russia, right? Because they could not risk that kind of cooperation, right?
yeah, absolutely.
So you can see just how insincere they are about changing Russian society. They're not sincere about that. They're interested in utterly destroying it first. That's why, Kallas, the president of Estonia, or is she the prime minister? I don't even care. Talked again this week about balkanizing Russia. And she said, "I don't want peace." Of course, she's a woman. Of course, she doesn't want peace. Women say shit like that all the time. Um, anyways,
No, but you're absolutely right. And even going back to '93, even going back to the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union, it wasn't an olive branch that was extended. It was a plundering campaign almost immediately afterwards, and
yeah,
it very well could have succeeded had a couple things just gone differently. But uh, Putin, love him or hate him, was able to bring some degree of stability to the country, and mind you, in a very conciliatory manner, was willing to work with the West for a number of years before this happened. And you even listen to some of his rhetoric, and might just be that, it might just be rhetoric. It's still uh, relatively conciliatory towards the West, despite everything. Um, I
Hmm.
mean, and you
Hmm.
even have Lavrov making more aggressive comments, saying that it's going to be at least a generation before there can be a Russian-European partnership, because that's how much enmity has been bred because of the events of the past 2 years. And I think that's more on track with the reality, but I digress. But going back to what you had said, it was established that the Americans were in charge after World War II in Western Europe, in places like France, Germany, and the UK in particular. I think were the big ones. But you look at the countries beyond the Iron Curtain, that was never really established them, because they fell under the Soviet umbrella. And look, say what you will about the communists. I'm not trying to claim anyone's perfect here, but it did provide that shield. It did provide that. And I know this isn't a new argument, particularly when it comes to cultural influences. But point being is, it did create that strong dividing line of American influence, at least in the sense of, say, empire and civilization, even just beyond just culture. And when that fell, they were able to, let's just say, sweeten the pot, get a lot of Eastern Europeans to join that voluntarily, say Poland, say Czech Republic, etc., the Baltic states certainly. But that didn't work in some parts. And I would say that Russia was certainly one of them. Even Ukraine wasn't one of them, which is why that they're playing so strong on the Ukrainian nationalism, trying to talk them into this. Because look, if they can't sell them on this liberal dream, then they're going to sell them on uh, just jingoistic nationalism, willing to march headfirst into the Russian meat grinder, and that's the results we've gotten here. Pragmatism is hard to be found, which I suppose Hungary is probably the primary example of one of the few places it did, with Slovakia to a lesser extent, and even maybe some of the Balkan states you could say that have some pragmatic streak in them, especially when it comes to this conflict. But it's just been a complete effort to subjugate this continent, just and even beyond what one would consider, I would say, a geopolitical necessity in order for America to be a global power. Because, and I'm not making the argument America should be a global power. I think it's been a disaster for everyone involved, Frank, and that includes just the populace of America in general. I think that they have not seen any sort of real fruits from this beyond maybe some material gain, which you can't deny that. But in terms of like actual quality of life, I don't think they've seen much of anything at all of that. But even just beyond the idea, if you were to believe that there was some good to be gained of America's global standing being what it is, it just became petty at a certain point. It just became overbearing, unnecessary. The idea that every single potential competition has to be subjugated, it creates a disastrous policy. It creates what we see today. And it's unsustainable. Nobody has managed to subjugate all the competition. And it's throwing away what power does have, what power I would say, in some sense, it has rightfully earned on just fruitless endeavors. The idea that the Russians might have their own sphere of influence, the Russians might have some parity with them, is, for whatever reason, that is just completely unacceptable to them. And I do think that goes back to, of course, the kind of people who are in charge of the American empire, the kind of ideology that they purport. When you look at empires of the past, there was some sense of national and ethnic interest to them. I'm not saying entirely, but there was some sense of that, which did create for a more, let's just say, level-headed approach to imperial policy. But that's completely out the window when it comes to America. It's a completely ideological empire, even more so than I would say the Soviet Union was for most of its history. Maybe the nascent Soviet Union is probably the closest comparison that we have in terms of just rabid ideology controlling this thing. And of course, ideology leads into justification for power. Justification for power leads to ideology. It's a vicious cycle. They feed
Yeah,
into
yeah,
each other. We all know that. I don't.
yeah.
So, like I said, just there's true believers, there's cynics, as we all understand, but uh, they do definitely inform each other. But not to get too far on that tangent. But I've never seen, like I said, a more, and I'm not claiming to be some great expert of history. I've tried to learn as much as I can. I do think that I've covered a fair ground across just a lot of different time periods and a lot of different parts of the world. But I cannot think of a single more ideologically driven state than America, especially post
Yeah,
1945.
you're right. And you could argue that it's becoming more and more ideological because it's hard power. I don't know. They're either unable to exert the kind of hard power that they used to exert. Maybe they have a different set of elites that would rather not. And there's a list of reasons why they would rather not. It could be based on, everything that the Americans have done post 9/11, but not exclusively, because the telltale signs were already there before 9/11 for, a critique of the American empire. Um, so yeah, but the other reason could very well be, like, if the ideology is the thing that you sell to the masses, why they should support the hard power part. And I know this is very reductionist, but it does explain to a great degree the model that we're trying to develop. If that's the case, then maybe there's a feeling, and we saw this with the election of Trump, that they feel like people are not, the buy-in into the American empire is not as strong as it used to be. And this is reflected with the military age men and the military situation, the ranks of the Americans and the British. Uh, you look at them and, you can't help but think of Rome and Ravenna and that, what is it, 476, 475 AD. Basically, the middle class had been just destroyed. And there just wasn't, nobody wanted to die for the Roman Empire anymore, and at least not in the West. It just wasn't there. And there's a lot of people that they don't want to die for America. Even Americans don't want to die for America. And that's why you see 24, 25% drop in, volunteers for all the, the four branches of the military.
And talk to a
And
lot
it's
of
not,
salt in the earth Americans. How many of them actually feel represented by this project anymore?
yeah,
I've seen several. I've heard several saying that this isn't the country I know that's it's like the traditional boomerism, what happened to my country, that kind of stuff. But I do think it is more real than it was in previous years. The fact that it's just unrecognizable, even what it was from the very highly ideological state it was post 1945. There was still some semblance of the idea that, hey, this state represents these people who are primarily people who are of Western European descent, who speak English, who are broadly speaking Christian, just give or take, and denominationally, there's things there, broadly Protestant, minority Catholic, otherwise, but you get the point here. But even that last vestige of it is completely erased, and these people just feel like aliens in their own home.
yeah, we've often said on the show that it's like the American government is in the business of training an army that's really much more similar to major urban police force centers, highly diverse, run by women or women of color, um, you know, all about various rights for this or that group. It's actually more about, policing what Hillary Clinton would have called, you know, um, the deplorables than it is about fighting, an existential war on the other side of the Atlantic, if you're supposed to believe that.
I know
Um,
this may be unpopular with some people, and there might be some disagreement with this, but I am of the genuine opinion that the best historical parallel you can make for America today is the late Ottoman Empire.
mm, hmm Yeah, I mean, who really even wants to die for this empire? Like, you look at the statistics. The amount of people that Biden let in through the southern border, just illegal, basically illegal immigration. Um, I mean, it just soars. It is way, way above anything from Trump and Obama. It's unprecedented. And I like, again, it's the policing action, right? there's a the white American group has to be made a minority and it has to be subjugated. I mean, they have cut probably 7 to 8 years at that time when you can expect um, white Americans to be a minority in their own country.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, just going back to that, there always has been a just built-in replacement mechanism from the beginning of America, just in terms of waves accepting immigrants and migrants from all parts of the world. That has just been an unfortunate reality of the way the system is built. But at least in previous times, you'd think, say, the Germans, the Irish, the other Europeans who came in, they were at least able to come to some sort of common understanding with the broader Anglo-Saxon culture, as it were. There was some degree of assimilation. Now, it didn't take entirely, but like I said, there were some bridges that were able to be built, and it still did end up in a relatively homogenous culture. And you'll notice as that goes on, you get to 1965 and beyond, they start to bring in more and more disparate people from Latin America, from East Asia, now increasingly you're seeing from the Indian subcontinent and Africa, where it just becomes more and more disparate in order to create the system that you're describing. And like I said, they've been trying at this, they've been picking away at this for years. And like I said, the first few waves weren't as successful, and also, let's be honest, weren't as deliberately targeted towards that. But it metastasizes as everything does, to the point
Yeah.
where you do have people from sub-Saharan Africa trying to cross through the southern border right now.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I'm back to thinking about whether this is a bluff or not. Like ultimately what the Americans would want is to prolong this war as long as possible without them having to go in, and eventually the war just goes too long for Russians to tolerate anymore, right? And you would have to depend on the Ukrainians being able to just hold on, one more month, just one more month, just, one more winter, and then, whatever.
And
I don't know if that's there. And I wonder, like, the other strategy obviously is the Europeans roll in with a substantial force, and they play a game of chicken with the Russians, and they say, if you hit us, we're going to launch mini nukes. I don't know, something
yeah,
like that.
I
Or
agree.
they make
And
an allusion to it, like, if you hit us, we will look at this as an act of war.
and
You
in
know.
terms of exhausting the Russian population, making the war effort too burdensome for them to continue supporting, the one key thing I don't think they're going to shake this factor here is that they need to peel away these countries that lean towards Russia but are not fully behind Russia. They would need India to implement sanctions. They would need Turkey, Egypt to implement sanctions. They
Hmm.
and like I said, all these countries, I wouldn't say they're. India might be a different case, but they're not necessarily on Russia's side, but they're open for business, so to speak. And
Yeah.
they would need to convince one or more likely multiple countries to get on board with the Western sanctions regime and to freeze Russian assets, to cease doing business with Russia, in order to make life economically hard enough to the point where the average Russian really feels the effect of this war effort. Now, I know there has been some, of course, economic hardship that has hit Russia because of the sanctions, but it has been largely bearable so far to the point where the population is willing to tolerate it for I guess you could say, greater cause. But they need to make that burn all the more if they want the Russian population to lose faith in its government and lose faith in this war effort, which I don't know what they could have up their sleeve that would make one or more of these countries decide to cooperate with that. And like I said, probably the biggest one they can crack is India. China, I think they've alienated sufficiently to the point where they're not going to be able to do that, barring any sort of just black swan event. But like I said, it's just that, a black swan event. India is probably the biggest, most reasonable one, and even that is a little bit of a stretch. But like I said, in terms of getting Russia to uh, cede this war on, I guess, quote unquote, peaceful terms, they need something like that to happen. I simply don't think that's going to happen. It's Russia's too valuable of a trading partner. It's too cooperative a trading partner for these, let's just say, less ideologically aligned states. In terms of raw material and resources and in proximity, it makes for very lucrative trade. It makes for a very lucrative economic partner. Something that at this point because the Americans, because of their economic policies, because of the way they've conducted themselves, have completely screwed themselves in that regard. And not to mention, in terms of loss of confidence, you also have the global guarantor of freedom of the seas unable to break a blockade over the Red Sea against a bunch of relatively poorly armed militants, let's just say. And also, you have this country that seems hell bent on freezing assets and seizing assets, which certainly doesn't create investor confidence if you're to ever cross this nation in any sort of diplomatic dispute. So, it, like I said, it's the idea. It's we have on one hand Americans keep tanking their own credibility through a series of very rash decisions, while the Russians, while they might not be the most beloved country in the world, it is a country that shows itself to be credible, that shows itself to be a reasonably good economic partner. And then you combine that, of course, with the Chinese as well, who have much similar reputation. It's really a no-brainer. I don't have the map on hand; it's on my old computer, but just look at the difference of trade volume between countries trading with the U.S. and trading with China from 2000 to 2020. In just a 20 years difference, even most quote-unquote Western countries trade more with China than they do the U.S. It's just it,
Yeah.
it's just been the way things have gone, and like I said, that's in no small part thanks to the American empire's uh, very highly ideological drive, not only in the Middle East but also more recently in Europe. It does seem like just the sheer might of China, in at least in economic sense, has forced them to be a bit more pragmatic in East Asia. But they're even starting to make more rash moves in the East, as we see, especially with the um, the speculation that China's going to invade Taiwan in monsoon season, which I look. I suppose we can address that at the end of the show if there's leftover time, but it's such an absurd accusation that I mean, just the idea of China resorting to a military solution in Taiwan at this point just doesn't make sense to me personally. I could go into my reasons for that, but just given the weather, just given the conditions of everything else, the idea that the invasion of Taiwan is imminent in the in the summer months is, I mean, there's no words for it. It's complete gaslighting. Uh, this is what they want you to believe. But like I said, even in the areas of the world where it's forced to be more pragmatic, it's making more rash and ideologically motivated decisions.
Yeah. Well, I think you put it very well. Um, I have to think that the current policy is still being guided by the election. But Team Biden wants to win, even if Team Biden is not going to live through his second term. That's obvious now. Um, Obviously, they would not want a retaliation from the Russians should they attack, because they will. That is so severe. Like, I don't know how strong the appetite is for the Biden administration to say, F it, we're going to go to a war. We're not even going to have an election. I, I'm sure there are people like that who are strategizing on Team Biden,
But
but
I don't think Biden can
I would
beat
like to
Zelensky.
think that they're a real minority, and what they want is a kind of like, yeah, it's not that great, but you know, Ukraine is holding on. They still haven't taken the big cities because, like, remember, all the critiques against Russia are like, well, where are they? How come they haven't reached the Dnieper? Like, they're never like, Russia took like I don't know if people know, Donetsk city is as big as Harkov, right? Like, okay, they took some major cities and they took Crimea from you. But like the question is, when are you going to get it back? Like, you didn't get it back for 8 years, and it's been another 2.5 almost. You still haven't gotten it back. But you know what I mean? There's a way. This rationalization is there. It can work because they fundamentally understand that Russia is a stronger power and that Ukraine is basically like this, I don't know, this poor zombie that is fighting for the West and thinks it's fighting for itself. And I just have to think that they're part of it is a threat to the Russians, like, don't advance too much, or we're gonna strike you. We're gonna strike deep. You know, Biden has an election. Like you not now. And of course, you know, people are saying that Trump is going to win. Like, he's definitely going to win. But I don't know. Since the last show, I don't know what difference it's going to make
Yeah, Trump has been
If
making
Trump.
some interesting comments, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah,
Some
that's what
quite
I'm
literally
getting at.
bombastic comments in terms
Yeah,
of. I think it was in particular he said that if Russia or China would have tried anything under him, he would have bombed either Moscow or Beijing. Which I mean, how true is that? I don't know. But point being, it
it's
showed
red meat for the MAGA patriots.
it
It's
is
like,
number one. Number two,
yeah.
but it also shows the kind of rhetoric he has to express if he wants to maintain even some, say, decent standing among the establishment. So, like I said, whether you want to believe that or not, who knows? But the idea of the fact that Trump even has to kowtow that line is not encouraging. Let's just put it like that.
There's just the way that Trump feels about Ukraine that he didn't feel about Syria.
Yeah.
Like he want, he's trying to remove all American troops from Syria and from Kosovo and gradually Bosnia. But you talk about Ukraine to that man, you better be careful.
Yeah, you better
it's,
be.
it's so absurd. He's of course he's doing it. Like I think it's almost certain he's doing this to make Biden look weak. He's very good at this kind of nonsense. And you can imagine like, the 90 IQ, MAGA peds, they're going to be all over this. We're going to have peace, but it's going to be an American peace, the best peace there is.
I don't know if you remember the
Russia and China are going to behave.
it was early on in the Ukraine war. Trump was doing a phone interview with one of the Fox News stations. And he was talking about how Putin was constantly using the N word. but
What?
no, I don't have the exact clip, and I don't want to play it because I don't want to deal with copyright nonsense. But he was like,
Yeah,
he was talking like
yeah.
Hannity or one of these people on Fox News. He's like, Putin was constantly using the N word, nuclear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the great Trump clips. But I mean, even in that, like you listen to what Trump was saying early on in the Ukrainian war, talking about how it's a genocide of Ukrainians and like employing this very uh, extreme rhetoric. But like I said, it's what you'd expect from it. It is red meat for the kind of people that you would expect. But like I said, the fact that it's gotten to this point, the fact that he needs to even if you want to assume it is just playing the game, doing the song and dance, the fact that he has to do it in the first place shows we're in a very concerning state as it is.
Right. And all they have to do, as long as we're going to talk about the election for a little while, if the Republicans are serious about winning, then they should like be investigating these ridings where, I mean, that's what we call them in Canada, but these areas where they have, specific laws that were introduced only a year or two before the election. Remember, Pennsylvania had a few of these, and I don't know if Fulton County had any, but like again, I don't hear anything about that, and to me, it says like the Republicans aren't serious about this.
I know the
Now,
only
I don't.
place that I've seen any sort of, let's just say, election integrity laws is credit where credit is due, Florida, which I give more credit to the legislature than I do its governor. I think it's fair to say that DeSantis has left a very sour taste in all of our mouths over various things at this point, but I digress. I've seen some stuff they've tried to push for in Arizona, but the governor keeps hamstringing that. So there have been some efforts towards that. There's been a stronger push for voter ID, stuff like that. But
Mhm.
it's wholly insufficient to prevent the kind of, let's just say, incidents we saw in 2020.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. I mean, not. I don't have the enthusiasm for Trump. Uh, I already had less in 2020 than I had in 2016. Nothing will ever compare to 2016. I mean, that year was a gift from God.
Remember when you used to end the shows 4 years ago with Biden 2020? There was like those few weeks there that he kept doing that. I think that was around the time like they were trying to like say oh Biden is like a neo-Confederate racist sympathizer. So we just
Oh God.
yeah that Biden voted to give Stonewall Jackson citizenship back, which is why Democrats are the real racists. I'm sure you all remember that sort of stuff, and that was the
Yeah,
kind of stuff coming out of the Trump campaign. It was very disappointing at the time. But
very
yeah,
cringe, very
and of
cringe.
course the Platinum Plan. I mean, that's not to say Trump isn't hilarious. He's hilarious in his own right. But like I said, it was weak compared to 2016. And you're right.
Yeah,
Nothing's going to compare. And unfortunately, we're not even getting a little bit of a rebound. It does seem to be on the same steady decline. And like I said, while Trump still has his funny moments, and I still see many of them, it's just the even
he does have a um, recovery arc, and that is immigration.
yes.
Immigration is so much worse in 2024 than it was in 2016 or 2020. I came up with the vaccine. He says so many stupid things, but if he wants to be on this redemption arc, right? If he wants to get like he could talk about, uh, he'll even get the black vote, with the amount of illegals that are pouring over the southern border. I'm not saying he will solve anything. He's not, obviously, but I'm saying if you want him in, right? Like I kind of look at him as, if he doesn't do anything really stupid or isn't coerced into it, or the military does something behind his back because they can't count on him to do it, which would imply that he has, like, I don't know, like decent human being reasoning, like pulling out of Syria. But in any case, barring all that, right? Like he could act as a kind of a bit of a destabilizing influence in the U.S.,
Well,
and
I
that
was
kind
I
of
was I was about
that
to
kind of would
say.
be welcomed.
I think the best argument you can make for Trump is the fact that he can grind the process of let's just say the American Empire's functioning not to a halt, but he can make their lives difficult. He can make the process more drawn out. He can make it harder than it needs to be, which I think is the argument I made for Trump in 2020, and the argument I will still tentatively make for Trump right now is that yeah he can drag his heels and he can make life harder for all the people I hate.
Yeah, the interesting thing I see with him, with respect to the war in Ukraine and Europe, it reminds me of those stories of the Roman Empire as it was expanding into Gaul, and there would be civic strife, and the governor at that time would basically fail to contain them, basically fail to discipline them, and he would be killed or he would be removed and maybe killed later, and they would replace him with one of their own, but except this one would be far worse, but it would work on disciplining them, on changing their behavior. In many ways, Trump's first term, or I should just say Trump's term in office, caused this rebellion amongst the NATO boomers, especially the leaders. And but all he did was ask them to contribute more money towards NATO. And along comes Biden, and he's asking for twice what Trump was asking for. And he didn't provoke a war in Europe either. But because he's one of their own, they'll go along with it. I just, I'm at kind of a loss. I know like most European plebs, they're worried about the economy. A good portion of them don't even think this war should have happened in the first place, or they want it to stop.
Yeah, like I said, you look at the opinion polls. The idea of getting the just European populace on board with this has been difficult to say the least, and
Yeah.
even on a governmental level, that's starting to bleed through the idea that it's just not sustainable. Like I said, the recent news that even more countries, including Italy, which Maloney, of course, took the very hawkish position towards Russia at the beginning of her tenure, before she betrayed her population on immigration, mind you. But that's aside the point here. Is even cautioning against the gas sanctions. You have the Italian defense minister saying that we don't want this conflict to expand. You have the Germans saying that we can't afford these sanctions to increase and intensify, while also soliciting for more anti-air systems to go to Kiev, mind you.
Hmm.
But like I said, you do have just this growing movement of discontent across Europe, especially among the populace. You see the right wing populist parties are starting to pick up popularity again, and a lot of them, on top of the immigration issue, are also campaigning the idea that we can't keep throwing life and limb, figuratively speaking, at least in their case, not so much the case of the Ukrainians, but we can't keep throwing half of our treasury into this fruitless war effort. Despite what you might think of the Russians or Ukraine's sovereignty or whatever, it's just not practical anymore. And like I said, you see that with the AFD polling the highest among German youth at this point. You see this with some of I know there's been infighting on the continental European right with Front National, but you even see that with them. They're polling higher and they're more skeptical of the war effort. But point being is these Eurosceptical, these parties that are also, let's just say, more adverse to any sort of further involvement in military conflict are picking up popularity. And like I said, I think Hungary is once again the pioneer in a lot of this that you see uh, heading towards European policy. And you still listen to a lot of Orban's comments when it comes to that there needs to be a comprehensive peace when it comes to involving the United States, Europe, and Russia. Is of course as well the Ukraine as being a warring party in this. Uh, that there needs to be some sort of restructuring. He was saying this back in 2021. He's been reiterating these points once again. But like I said, I think you bring up a good point that a lot of the European populace just is either neutral or feeling the heat of the secondary effects of this. But you still, of course, do have the European elite and even some of the let's just say people of higher socioeconomic class in Europe who are just sold in this war for very ideological or let's just say personal interest reasons.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, of all those parties, obviously, I think the AfD is the most serious. Le Pen is just not serious. She's irrelevant. Um, she just wants, I don't know, she just wants power. She just wants to lead the country. She just believes that's her role. She has to, even if it's just for 5 years, that's what she ought to do. And I don't know. I mean, she has denounced the AfD, and she will walk everything back, right? And I wouldn't bet too much. I mean, I guess their main focus will be immigration. And it could be a great bargaining chip, kind of like, well, we're going to continue the war for Ukraine, but we're going to need motivation, and that motivation can only be expressed if you do something about immigration. Okay, so but
That's really all I can say.
but
But
it's only the only place where there's stiff resistance to all this neoliberal boomerism that's infected Europe is, of course, with the youth of Germany singing "Ausländer raus."
so true.
So, I love that video of one of the cable cars or streetcars in Germany that's bouncing up and down, and the place it's packed. People are jumping up and down. The whole thing is like rocking up and down, and they've got Ausländer raus. I mean, look what they did. These young adults have, I think, they've been temporarily arrested and they've been fired from their jobs. Um, the only thing that can change that is defeating Russia,
So true.
because Russia is really creating the immigration situation in Europe. It's not America. It's
Yeah,
not.
well, I also think Wagner Group is in Africa. That's the entire purpose of their mission is to
Yeah.
is to ferry over migrant boats. Now, ignore the country that the NGOs supporting migration are based out of. We're not going to talk about that. In fact, we actually are going to talk about that in a different context, and I think we all know which
Hmm.
country I'm referring to. There's been some interesting news out of Israel as of late, and by interesting, I mean even people who were tentatively in support of Israel are quickly losing sympathy for them as a result of the strikes on Rafah earlier this week, in this past week. And there was a strike on one of the refugee sectors in Rafah that I don't know what the exact casualty count was. Did you see an update on that? Because I know it was, at least the
Mm.
footage was not something I wanted to frankly see. And if you don't have the stomach for it, I recommend that you avoid. It was
Oh.
like more brutal than anything I've seen out of particularly this Israeli conflict, and certainly more brutal than anything I've seen out of Ukraine or Russia so far. But it was the strike on the refugee camp in Rafah along the Egyptian border as the Israelis do continue their operation into Rafah. Now, there has been the copes, there has been the excuses coming out that it was a tragic miscalculation on part of the Israelis. That's the
Hmm.
position of the U.S. That's the position of the Likud government. That's the position of several Western governments at this point. And this also coincides with two very interesting events at the. I can't believe I'm saying this at the UN, because I know the UN is a worthless body, has no real authority, but you do see that there was the vote for Palestinian statehood, Palestinian membership within the UN that did get struck down ever so narrowly, but that of course did get struck down. You have several European countries and several countries across the world that are preparing to recognize the Palestinian state in conjunction with the Israeli state, really trying to push the two-state solution, as it were. And then the other interesting thing coming out of the UN that I think just very interestingly contrasts this is the Srebrenica genocide vote that they've been trying to push with this. And I mean, of course, for those who don't know, it was the alleged massacre of a number of Bosnian Muslims at the hand of Serbian forces during the Yugoslav wars. And like I said, at what is worse, just a massacre. And I don't have the full details of the situation. You probably know a lot more about it than I do. At worst is at what is worse, a massacre they're trying to call an entire genocide. And I think the purported casualties of that are only like what, how many, like 3,200, or maybe I've confused another one. But point being is that they're trying to apply the label of genocide to this, and to, like I said, what is at worst a one-off massacre in this terms. But all the while you have these brutal Israeli strikes on what are quite literally refugees, the areas that the safe zones that they told them to evacuate to along the Egyptian border. And I know in the lead up and aftermath of this, there has been saber rattling, there has been Egyptian forces moving towards the border. There was allegedly, after that strike, skirmishes between Egyptian and Israeli forces, which didn't escalate into anything further. But it does take one of those skirmishes to get out of hand before something like that happens. And mind you, Egypt, out of all of the Arab nations, is on relatively good terms with Israel. Now, that has soured greatly in the past 7 months since October 7th. And I know
Hmm.
Sisi is really trying to play the middle ground with this. He doesn't want to embroil Egypt in a war. Egypt is in a very comfortable position as it is on the global stage, so he doesn't want to push for that. But there is growing discontent within Egypt, within Cairo. There's street demonstrations about what's happening in Israel right now. There are demands for more actions. And like I said, uh, this could very well be the opening for maybe yet another coup. I wouldn't go that far, but this is how these sort of things start, where somebody who promises more action on an issue of this creative scale, uh, this is how it begins. And I know that the Egyptians, for very reasonable statement, have refused to open the border crossings into Egypt because they know that it is just ceding Gaza to Israel if they do that. And not to downplay the human cost, especially in light of the recent events, but that is a calculus that they have to make. A real damned if you do, damned if you don't situation where you can let in these 2 million Palestinians, have to deal with housing them, have to deal with integrating them in society, and also on top of ceding, quite literally ceding their land to Israeli annexation, because there's really no other way to put it. Or they can be the quote unquote responsible party for not opening the borders and taking these people in while they're suffering and dying, which, like I said, it creates just a, there's no winning move they can do in this.
Hmm.
And I don't want to make the argument that I think Egypt should just go into Gaza, even though I'm sympathetic to that argument. I think at this point the Egyptians have more than enough justification under any sort of quote unquote international law that you want to state for them to march troops into Gaza. Frankly, and I think it might be worth the escalation with Israel at this point, not to downplay the potential conflict it would have, but beyond And look, I'm no bleeding heart about any of this. I don't get me wrong, but Israel has proven itself to be a completely unhinged state. I mean, on top of what's happened since October 7th, you can go back further. There's several examples you can go back to. But I would say, especially the strikes on Syria and Iran at this point, especially the unprovoked strikes in the Iranian consulate in Syria, just an attack on a diplomatic building because it allegedly had IRGC members, which is, according to Israel, a terrorist organization, despite the fact that, once again, it is a military arm of the Iranian state, love it or hate it. That that this was the outgrowth of this. I mean, Israel, like I said, I don't want to advocate for an escalation war. I'm trying not to do that. But Israel is an unhinged state that needs to be brought to heel by one mean or another. And whether that is regional partners, whether that's pressure out of the West, this country cannot continue to go on, or else this is going to fester into a situation that's going to go completely out of all our controls. It's going to have far worse consequences than I think any of us could really imagine. And I'm not trying to be dramatic about this, I'm not trying to exaggerate about this, but we're talking about a country that has nuclear weapons, a country that has constantly antagonized all of its neighbors which are very well connected to some power block or another. I mean, this could very easily spiral out of control. And like I said, I'm not advocating the Egyptians go into Gaza, despite my previous statements, the fact that I do think that if they wanted to, they could very easily justify it. Uh, but like I said, if something is not done, even beyond the even if you do not care about civilian casualties, even if you don't care about what's happening in Gaza, I'll cede that point just for the sake of argument. For the sake of regional and global stability, something has to be done about this situation, about this nation that acts with impunity. And it's the sort of impunity that a nation this size and scope simply does not have. You can make a case that larger nations do have a right to act more, well, not necessarily a right, but do have more room to act more belligerent just because of the nature of geopolitics. And I'm open to that argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm open to that argument. But a
Yeah,
country of Israel's caliber conducting itself the way it is just a recipe for instability, just a recipe for disaster. I mean, you even want to compare it to the. I know a lot of not that I think we have anyone listening to the show, a lot of Israel defenders will talk about, well, what about all the stuff that Israel's neighbors have done? What about all the stuff the Arab and Muslim states have done? Well, and even at their worst, say like Hafez al-Assad's massacre of the Muslim Brotherhood in what was it? Was that that was in Aleppo, I think. It was in one of the
I
northern
mean it's a
cities.
separate issue. I mean,
Yeah, no,
Israel literally
yeah,
it trains and takes care of ISIS. ISIS kills Christians. In in Alexandria a few years ago. Like I don't like. Um, I mean, Christ was crucified as as Ramsey Paul likes to say, for hate speech, but it was hate speech that angered Jews, not Romans.
yeah, it's
Okay,
absolutely.
and I like, just from a theological point of view, no, I don't believe they have a right to that land or any land. I don't.
Oh,
I'm sorry if that
absolutely.
makes some people mad. I don't care.
And that was the prevailing Christian view for 1800 years, even among Protestants.
Yeah,
It was non-controversial to say in the least. But
totally non-controversial, but
yeah,
we're Orthodox, so
yeah, and like I said, I agree with that. I think if you were to press a lot of people on that, they would agree with that statement if they were being really honest about the situation. Yeah, that they especially do not have a right to that land. And like I said, you want to even compare this to the other massacres and the other extreme acts of violence taken by their neighbors. Like I said, even what like the worst of what Saddam Hussein was alleged to have done is pales in comparison to what we see right here. And it's complete madness. And like I said, even if you want to look at this from a completely pragmatic point of view, and I will once again play devil's advocate. Let's say Israel, most moral army in the world. Let's say all that crap is true, and that it's this shining beacon of liberty and democracy in the Middle East. If you care about that, point being is a country like that, of its size, behaving like that towards its neighbors, which at many point are either peer or near peer powers. It's a recipe for disaster. I don't care how great this country allegedly is. It needs to be brought to heel one way or another, or we're all going to pay the consequence. We're all going to pay the price for the consequence of their actions. That's it. It just comes down to that.
yeah, yeah. I'm gonna send you some of the articles that are popping up because you know, and just before I do, this is something that I think bears mentioning, right? You remember the show that we did before this one? We were talking about, Israel expects to be the exceptional nation, very much the way America expects to be the exceptional nation, right? But even more so than America, right? Both absurd, but that's what they believe. And I said, regarding the ICC or the ICJ for that matter, which is younger than the ICC, that these courts, in and of themselves, are literally for adversaries of America, or for vassals, or for enemies, or whoever is obligated. But America's not obligated. But America would not want a world without the ICC or the ICJ. Do not make that mistake, right? America simply believes it is the sovereign and it is above the law, just as Israel does, right? And so, what did we learn when the ICC sent out arrest warrants, or said that they would send out arrest warrants, but subsequently they were sent out for Gallant and Netanyahu, right? Um, as guilty of genocide, which they are. Um, the thing is, one of the judges let out that, and I think it was Lindsey Graham who said, "Your court is literally for Africans and thugs like Putin," which is almost exactly what I was saying, right? It was almost exactly, and I've been saying it for longer than that, but like when we critique the UN, it's a false neutral. It's there to, like, it's there for you to think that there's a system of checks and balances, and those conservatives, now they finally agree with the liberals. It took them 5 years, but when they do that, they legitimize not only the system, but the values of the Democrats and so on. So they all have their role to play, and this court does too. So I get very, I don't really get frustrated, but I think it's typical, typical of the dissident right. They're kind of like, a lot of them are kind of stupid and emotional. Like, for instance, they'll say they have no authority. Oh, I love to see them get, arrest Netanyahu. Like, they miss this bigger point, right? Like, and then that's why they can't even predict, like, maybe someday someone will say what the court was really designed for, but they can't even get to that level. In any case, I feel quite vindicated that this was said, and that he felt he should mention this, because, it's kind of like, like it or not, it's woke. Um, but the fact of the matter is, countries like Norway, Germany, Spain, other countries have come on board since. They recognize Palestine as an independent country now. Well, like, ultimately, what they want is, like, basically what the power that the Pope had, right? It wants to be a rival castle to America, and you see a lot of European countries that are looking at this ruling as a way to assert whatever amount of independence from America they have, right? And now I know it's a paltry thing that it's just the ICJ and the ICC, but the fact of the matter is, like, the elites on either side of the Atlantic are jokers, and it doesn't matter. Like, ultimately, what you want is a civilization that nobody is willing to die for. Like, that is ultimately what you want, and this is a win-win. Why? Because if America says we're going to discredit the ICC, the ICJ, then America's approval of it. When Slobodan Milosevic was in there, when Saddam Hussein, back then, it was like, oh, it was great. It was a move in the right direction, right? And not when it's one of their own butchers. And so. Um, So if they discredit it, that's kind of a win. And if this ruins um, Israel's special status, the exception to the rule, therefore it's a sovereign, right? Whoever doesn't have to obey the rules is the sovereign. And in Israel case, whoever disobeys the rules and the red lines and gets military weapons and money is really the sovereign, right? So what you like, you want this. This is a great outcome, right? And to some extent, the ICJ has played it well. Like, for instance, they advise against, they condemned going into Rafah. Basically, they mirrored what Biden was saying. Now, if they had been more harsh, you can bet the Americans would have gone against them and they would have grandstanded the whole time. But they didn't, they couldn't, because it was basically mimicking what Biden had said. So, I mean, that's strategy. That's good strategy. Whether you like them or not, that's good strategy. And so, um, yes, I'm interested in both America and Israel not being exceptions to the rule. And and if it's a rinky-dinky court like the ICC and the ICJ that cause a split, all the better. Like, I don't care. It amazes me. Like, I don't know. Like, you still happy with the regime? Like, you're really gonna get into the whole like ICJ? I mean, it's people who still have like a very emotional tie to to this civilization, and basically they're thinking like, well, they're not going to get us, like it's the kind of people that 10 years ago or like, remember when Alex Jones used to think like the UN and NATO were going to invade America? Like, remember how
Operation
stupid.
Jade Helm.
Yeah, Jade Helm. Remember how stupid that was? I mean, that's literally where these people are. They're just that dumb. It's like, it's an American project, you idiots. And they think like, well, no American would want to be global. I mean, well, yeah, you are. You have been for almost 100 years. Like, what are you talking about? Anyways, but I thought that was interesting. Now, and you can see that this narrative, especially after everything that's happened, because there are a lot of people who are, of a certain group who've been very affected by this. So here is I'm going to send you. A picture of new on tablet, uh, an article by Jeremy England. Yes, he is that. This is one of
Oh, this
the
is an interesting headline. I'm sure the people will be eager to see
the
this.
it's just amazing, isn't it? Israel must like Israel begging, like, what are you talking about? You have like they don't understand, like,
That's
Netanyahu can
that's a
talk about
brazen
how
headline. That
absolutely brazen. It's so brazen. And this is what I mean. Like it's like their brazenness will only increase if they win, right? Like that's what you're going to get.
I mean, I'll put it this way. I've always had some degree of sympathy with the Palestinians, just on a human level, and even more so when I figured out that, like, yeah, they have one of the oldest Christian populations in the world naturally, but even discounting all of that, I just want Israel to lose.
Mhm.
Just look at these headlines. Just look at this quote.
It's
I
outrageous.
just want this country, this degenerate little statelet. It really is the epitome of a statelet, even more so, I would say, than Lithuania, than any of the Baltic states, any of Moldova, Czech Republic. More of a statelet than even those, especially
Yeah.
in mindset.
And a victory over the Palestinians will mean more harsher treatment of Christians in Israel.
Oh, absolutely.
Like it, it will become even more brazen, and it will mean harsher treatment of Christians in global homeland, America, Canada, Australia, the UK, Germany, and France also to a certain
I
degree
mean,
as
look at all the
well.
speech codes that they tried to do. Look at the one that they
Yeah,
recently pushed through. I can't remember what it was, but I know a lot of people were talking about how the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. That's what it was. Now, it wouldn't be like a letter of the law, but it would be civil rights law, which is, just as bad. They can destroy your life all the same.
yeah, it's a
And
step in the
yeah,
you know.
and that included saying, oh, the Jews are responsible for the crucifixion of Christ in anti-Semitic statements, despite the fact that it said plainly in Scripture. That's like
Right,
I
and it's
said,
part of our Easter liturgy. So,
stuff like that. It exactly like that. And if they win, they're going to be more emboldened. They're going to be more brazen, and they're going to push more of that. They're going to push more of everything that they push. Criticism is going to, and one of the other ones they included in that was denying Israel's right to exist was one of the other ones. And like I said, it's only going to get more brazen. It's going to grow beyond civil rights laws. That especially, I would say in places like Europe where they do have more means of enforcement for speech restrictions. I'm not saying that America is some sort of a great exception by no means, but I'm just saying it's just because of the way our legal system is structured, it is substantially more difficult. They will find a workaround if given the opportunity. Don't get me wrong with that, but it it's going to reverberate out into, like I said, everyday things going to embolden the regime. They're going to act more brazenly. They're going to blame disloyal elements for the fact that it even got this far out of control in the first place. Same for Ukraine as well. Whereas in the case of defeat of both, they may have some sort of lashing out. They're not going to have the political capital to do this. They're going to have to deal with the embarrassment of having lost, let's just say, in this case, both major wars it has embroiled itself in. And at that point, like, yeah, I'm sure there'll be some suppression of, let's just say, more dissident elements. But they're, at the end of the day, not going to have as much political capital as they would in the terms of that they would if they had a victory. And like I said, so these consequences do reverberate back to us in this case, regardless. And I don't know what else to say about this. It's a shtetl with an air force. I can't remember who said it, but they put Israel the
mhm.
best way I could have considered. It is a shtetl with an air force. It is the mind of these people, of these peasants who lived in Eastern Europe for a number of centuries, who were second-class citizens, rightly or wrongly. We can have that discussion. How they were treated back then, irrelevant. But point being is, they never escaped that mindset. Even the ones from, say, a more well-off background never escaped that mindset. And they put that policy into both statecraft and foreign policy, and it's been a disaster, an absolute disaster, an unmitigated disaster, and we're all made to bear the brunt of this. And it will continue on so long as the state exists. And I'm serious at this point that if any nation deserves the Rainbow Nation South Africa treatment, it's Israel. Let it happen there.
Yes,
Let
yes.
them have truth and reconciliation for all I care. They can deal with that trash fire for all I care.
It makes no difference. We will have that here for forever until the stay on its feet anymore, regardless of whether it happens in Israel or not. So it's not relevant. It's not like, well, if Israel has to do it, then that means we have to do it for longer. No, no, you're going to do it, right? Like you do it because that state exists,
Oh
right?
yeah, absolutely. Like I said, they're already doing it here. I know it isn't as explicit yet. Maybe in some parts of the world. I know that up north where you are, it's got, especially when they had the whole the whole residential school nonsense that more or less came out to be completely fake, to nobody's surprise. That they've tried that, but like I said, they're already pushing this. It's already practically the state ideology, the state religion, if we want to be that bold. And you know what? If any nation deserves to be dragged through the mud with us, it's Israel. Frankly, let it happen to them. As far as I can, don't care anymore.
Plus, the thing is like, I mean, they were saved. I know that, who argues the opposite, but they were saved by uh, kind of like the European tradition of universal values. You could argue it is the um, Platonic in nature, or that it's um, what's the 13th century um, Roman Catholic saint
I'm
that
trying
I'm
to think of
thinking of.
Aquinas,
Um,
or
the
are you,
whole
or do you have
the
somebody
chat
else in
will
mind?
know, and I'm embarrassing myself right
Okay.
now. Anyways, it's just escaped. I mean, Aquinas. Okay, so they're saved by that, basically that idea. And now in this article, you're saying, no, 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 we can't have that. They have to understand like just how special we are, and especially how special we are to ourselves. We can't wait for a hegemon to dictate to us, right? Like it's an affront. It's just hilarious to me.
Oh, absolutely. It's and yeah, the brazenness of oh, you didn't save us. The fact that I mean, uh, one microcosm of this that I don't want to get too far down into the weeds with this because I know that we're coming up on time in the next few minutes here.
Yeah, I
Uh,
have
but
to get going as
but
well.
just the relations between Israel and Poland, the way that the Israeli state to this day treats Poland, uh, and like I said, and you look at Europe and you look at these right wing, these quote unquote populist governments, whole hog behind Israel. No non kosher pun intended there, but whole hog behind Israel. And you have you have Israel blowing up Polish aid workers in Gaza. That happened a few months back. I'm sure you remember. You have them laying the blame for certain 20th century events at the feet of Poland, despite the fact that Poland, for that entire time, was under German occupation. And look, I know that some people might say some things about the Germans during that time period, whatever. But it was a brutal occupation in Poland, regardless, especially for the Polish people. I don't think that can be understated. But they still lay the blame for certain events at the feet of the Polish people. 2018, that they were very big on that. Israeli media was just constantly pressing this campaign here, and this is the fruits of being Israel's friend and ally. This is the way I've never seen a nation, especially a nation that claims to be in as desperate position as Israel is, treat its supposedly few allies that always kvetches about having so few friends. I've never seen it put more disparaging remarks upon these people. And then you want to talk about the diaspora. Uh, they, they they can't help themselves but to mock and deride the most philo-Semitic population in the world, that being
Yeah,
American white Protestants. They can't get enough of mockery and derision of, like I said, the most philo-Semitic population in the world, bar none. And this is the sort of neuroticism that runs the state, that runs these people, and they wonder why they're in this position. And you know what? I do think as time goes on, as Israel continues to push the envelope further and further, I think we need to look at a position where, yeah, the idea that, well, no biblical Israeli state Israelite kingdom, I should say, rather than Israeli state for the sake of accuracy, lasted more than 80 years. We might be coming up on that 80 years. I know that we are. 2028 will be that 80 years, but will Israel make it? I know Israel's at 77 right now, and that's it's usually from that range from 77 to 80 where they would just completely implode. And given the political troubles that happened even before October 7th, it started to point towards that direction, and just
be
the
terrible if it was crucified.
yeah, that's yeah. To quote Jeremy England, that's why you have to live by the law, right? Live by the.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hmm.
I I I have so few words for these people. It's disgusting. But just to round out the show, just with a little bit of a lightning round, as we had mentioned earlier. And I don't know, unless you have any further thoughts before I get into this.
No, no, that's fine.
So Georgia, by parliamentary veto, did manage to implement the foreign agent law, which requires the registration of NGOs. So that was effectively curtailed there. You have similar laws being pushed in Slovakia and Turkey right now, so we'll see how that goes, and we'll see. Um, I mean, even Fico's assassination attempt you had. I can't remember. It was either Borrell. It was one of the EU Commission snakes talking about how. Well, you wouldn't talking to the Georgians about. Well, you wouldn't want to see what happened to Fico happen to any Georgian politician, right? Brazen threat,
That's right.
by the way.
Yeah.
So you have that. Yeah, you have the EU trying to put the screws down on the Georgian situation now. And then, as I mentioned before, China is allegedly going to invade Taiwan in monsoon season. Uh, I'm just beyond any of that. And I know there was also just finally a little bit of a cleaning house in the Russian MOD, that have been some dismissals and arrests on corruption charges of several officers and bureaucrats within the MOD. So it does look like the new administration is taking action, is using this as an opportunity to clear out some of the people who may have hampered the war effort early on, some of the people who have led to the inefficiency of the Russian war effort, say in the opening phases of the war. So we'll see how that develops. I don't think it's as drastic as some people want you to believe. They want you to think that, oh, this is just like what Stalin did. Of course, they can never escape the comparisons that a fourth grader could make. But I mean, that's to be expected of these kind of people. But those were just the few straggling news items I had. Unless you have any last minute thing.
No, did we talk about the yeah, we did talk about the helicopter crash. And there is a theory, of course. You probably heard of it. There were even some articles that I saw from fairly decently regarded publications, that Raisi was offed by the Ayatollah, and primarily because, I mean, even Caspian Report did a whole video on this. There's a very strong speculation on his part. And we've talked about this on the show before as well, that, the Ayatollah's son is sort of destined to be the Ayatollah himself. Now, he's younger than Raisi was. Raisi was going to, I believe he was either up for re-election or he was leaving office this year. People in the chat can correct me, but he was then supposed to go to the Experts Council, which is, I believe it's voted upon by the public, but they themselves then exclusively they vote for the Ayatollah. Who would be the Ayatollah? Because it's this whole framework about, what power does the Ayatollah have? How public is it? It's quite complex, right? The president of Iran does not have power like the president of Russia or even America or even a prime minister of Britain. It's much more limited. He has no control over like geopolitics, declaration. The Ayatollah is ultimately the supreme ruler. And Raisi even changed his last name, I think, which is like something like Fadeh, which means like king or kingly, to what was his current name, Raisi, which means cleric. So obviously he wanted this role. Some of the reasons why people suspect that it was a job by the Ayatollah is because they switched helicopters at the last moment. And the helicopter that they went into had no transponder. And this is why it took so long to find it. I mean, that and unbelievable fog, as we showed on the last show. The other bit of news that was revealed around this event was one of the pilots gave an interview and mentioned how, they had flown over this area. They were returning from Azerbaijan. Yes, there was a lot of fog, but it was mostly in the lowlands, in the valleys. And except for this one mountain peak or very large hill that they were flying toward, all the other hills did not have clouds, but this particular one did. And it is this one where the helicopter containing Raisi and the foreign minister, that was another strange anomaly. Like, why there were three helicopters? Why did the two most important political figures ride in the same helicopter? Right? There's something odd about that. This is not something that would be like the scale of this. If there is like a sinister reason why this happened, it would not be Israel. It would be something internal to Iran. And people have argued that Raisi was maybe too close to the Russians. Now, people say he wasn't popular, but he won by 72%. The counter argument to that is that a lot of people have given up on voting in Iran because they don't see how anything could possibly change. So there's that. But A lot of there is still some, I would say, some very strong support. Uh, for the concept of the Islamic Republic is what, not necessarily Raisi in particular, although there is support for him. So, you know, um, that is a theory. That is a very interesting theory. And actually, I should mention that the day before, Academic Agent had a stream. It might have been Unpopular Opinions where they mentioned this as well. So I thought I'd mention it too. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
we'll
think
probably never know, but
it's the most plausible explanation I've heard beyond an accident. So,
yeah, yeah. Like I, if it was down by some missile, like we know at the beginning of the show, we talked about very complex radar systems and AWACS planes. There would be countries that would know, and I would
absolutely.
imagine that Russia and China would be very concerned if Israel did this, and they would want to, reveal who was responsible for that. But we don't have any, evidence so far that suggests that.
No, and like I said, I'm intrigued by that theory, but I think you laid it out well. There's not really much I can
I mean,
add
it's a
without.
45-year-old helicopter,
Yeah,
right? And
that's
why did they even if you say, well, why did they go into the helicopter without like a transponder, without some kind of GPS homing system? Like, wait a minute, why did they go into that helicopter? The question is, why do they still have helicopters like that?
yeah, and you could talk about sanctions, whatever,
That's
but point
insane.
being is relations with Russia and China have increased, even to the point of like we're importing civil aircraft for civil aviation. It should not have been a challenge at all. And not to mention,
Yeah,
I know that Iranian industry is competent enough where it could manufacture a civilian, well, I shouldn't say civilian, but a non-military aircraft. It's now not maybe not like jumbo jets, but something like a simple helicopter for the transportation of the head of state is not out of the capability of Iranian industry. So the idea that they're still fielding these 45-year-old helicopters that probably haven't had access to proper maintenance parts in uh, since the revolution, for being frank, it yeah, a lot of stuff doesn't add up. I'm really curious to see if anything more comes out of this case, but I think that you've said all that can be said for the time being.
yeah. If there's something nefarious, this is it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report. We covered quite a bit of ground, and hopefully you walk away with something. We'll be back in the near future, and have a nice day, evening, night, whenever you may see this. For those of you in the premiere, have a
Oh
nice
wait,
evening. Oh yes, please go ahead.
sorry, we almost. I mean, I almost forgot. So, why don't you show them the picture, like just remembering old times?
Oh yes.
Even though a Canadian citizen, me going to the U.S. For supporting, supporting Trump. I think they'll get a tickle out of it.
Yeah, this is a live face reveal of War Report co-host GSP. Maybe not too much a face reveal, but you'll get a whole new image from 2016 Trump rally back in the good old days. There he is, the man himself. uh, what more can
I'm
you say?
hoping people realize this is a joke. Like that.
Wait, this is a joke.
I wish it was real.
Yeah. I did. I've seen you in person. I know you're lying to me, but now that we've had the proper outro to that, thank you. I almost forgot. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care, guys.